All right, so we're back, and today we're diving into something that I think is really, really fascinating, and it's all about the MetaQuest VR platform. Lots of you have sent in a ton of information from GDC 2025. Looks like there were some pretty interesting updates shared there. So our mission today is to basically figure out where the platform stands right now. How are people actually using it, and what does all of this mean for the future of VR content, especially given what you've sent in?
Yeah, for sure. And I think right away when you look at the data, a couple of numbers really jump out. First, over $2 billion has been spent on Quest content.
Wow.
That's a pretty massive amount of money. And then you pair that with the 30% increase in monthly headset usage that we saw in 2024.
That's huge.
Yeah, I mean, that paints a pretty clear picture of a platform that's really starting to gain some serious traction.
Yeah, it sounds super impressive. But here's where things start to get really interesting to me, at least from what I saw. Meta Reality Labs. Since the Quest 2 launched, they've made about $9 billion, but less than $2 billion of that is from content.
Interesting.
Right, so we're talking like over $7 billion just from hardware sales, maybe some other services. It really makes you wonder, are people just buying the headsets or are they actually investing in the experiences?
Right. I mean, it makes you think about how people are using their headsets. Like, what's the main driver?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, one way to think about that $2 billion figure for content spending is to look at how it's grown over time. Back in February of 2022, Meta announced that they hit that $1 billion mark in content spending. But then just 8 months later, by October 2022, they were already at $1.5 billion.
Wow.
So it's definitely growing. I mean, it's clearly on an upward trajectory. But you're right. It's still happening in this world where the initial hardware purchase seems to be what's driving most of the revenue for Meta.
Yeah.
Maybe it's that initial hurdle, right? Like
Mhm.
you got to buy the headset first, and then you decide how much you want to spend on games and experiences.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like the barrier to entry. And it's not just about the money though, right? Because the usage numbers, those are super compelling. I mean, a 30% jump in monthly active users in just a year.
Yeah, that's a big leap.
It is. Plus, it sounds like the Quest 3 is holding on to users better than the older models. So people aren't just buying these things and then forgetting about them. They're actually using them, coming back for more.
Right, exactly. Chris Pruitt, he's the director of content at Meta, he said something that really sums this up well. He said, quote, "The number of people who own and are actively using a headset is larger than it has ever been."
Mm.
So that really seems to indicate that VR is moving past just those hardcore early adopters.
Mm.
It's finding a wider, more mainstream audience.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, let's dig a little deeper into how people are actually using these headsets, especially this growing audience. One of the stats that really caught my eye was the whole rise of free-to-play. I mean, it's pretty wild. Apparently, over 70% of the time spent on Quest is now happening in these free-to-play apps.
Yeah.
So that's a massive amount of engagement in stuff that doesn't have an upfront cost.
It is a big shift. And Pruitt even said himself that this popularity of free-to-play has definitely affected spending on some of those paid VR titles.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's kind of logical, right? If you're spending most of your time in VR in free experiences, maybe you're not as willing to buy a bunch of paid games on top of that.
Right, right. You're kind of getting your fill, so to speak.
Exactly.
But here's the weird thing, and I think you touched on this earlier, but even with all this time people are putting into free to play, the majority of the money being made on Quest still comes from those paid titles,
Yeah.
which seems a little contradictory.
It is interesting. It's like people are willing to try the free stuff.
Yeah.
But those really dedicated VR users, the ones who are really into it, they're still the ones driving the financial success for most developers, it seems.
Right. So maybe it's about different segments of the audience engaging with VR in their own ways.
Exactly. And I think Pruitt actually have a really useful perspective on this. He connected it to trends in the wider gaming world. He pointed out that things like overall spending flattening out a bit,
Okay.
maybe there's less investment in those middle tier games.
Hmm.
And then, of course, you have the massive success of those huge live service games, and then also some indie games doing super well.
Yeah.
That's happening across the entire gaming landscape, he said, not just VR.
That is a good point. It's a good reminder that VR isn't in a bubble.
Right.
Now, another change that I think is worth talking about is the audience itself, especially with the Quest 3S coming out.
Yeah.
Pruitt mentioned that it, quote, signaled a larger audience shift than we expected.
Interesting.
So I'm really curious about this. Who are these new people using VR?
Well, the main thing seems to be a change in demographics. Prue explained that the people who are buying the Quest 3S, they tend to be younger than the people who bought the older Quests, and they generally have less money to spend.
Interesting.
So that's a pretty big shift in who the main customer is for the platform now.
It sounds like teenagers are a big part of this new group. I read that they're the majority of the Quest 3S buyers and users.
Yeah, there are a lot of teenagers using VR now.
That's pretty fascinating.
It is, and what's even more interesting is what they're into.
What are they playing?
Well, it seems like their preferences kind of mirror what they like on other platforms.
Yeah.
Pruitt mentioned that they're really into those free-to-play games, especially the ones that have a strong social element.
Okay.
He gave the example of Gorilla Tag. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
I haven't actually.
It's a pretty wild game. You're basically a gorilla and you have to tag other gorillas. But it's very physics-based, so there's a lot of flailing around.
Oh, that sounds chaotic.
It is, and it's super popular, especially with the younger crowd.
Huh.
But Pruitt also pointed out that these teens are buying paid games too,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
specifically what he called meme games.
Meme games.
Yeah, so think about games that are like super quirky, kind of humorous, and maybe they go viral because of trends on the internet. A good example would be I Am Cat. It's exactly what it sounds like. You get to experience the world as a cat.
That's amazing.
It's totally bonkers, and
Yeah.
people love it. So you can see how that lines up with what teens are playing on other platforms. It's all about social interaction and those kind of funny offbeat games.
Yeah. Meme games. I like that. Okay, so we've got this huge influx of younger users who are really into free stuff and these very trend-driven games.
Right.
But you also mentioned another group that's emerging, right? More like mainstream adults who are buying headsets.
Right. And it seems like this group isn't so interested in that whole super immersive VR stuff or mixed reality.
Okay, so what are they using their headsets for?
Pruitt described them as seeing the headset as basically just an extension of their TV. Yeah. It's more about media consumption for them. Like they want to watch sports, action movies, concerts, that kind of stuff. They're not really looking for those interactive VR experiences. The headset is just another screen in their house.
Huh. So how about games? Are these folks playing games in VR at all?
They might play some games, yeah. But it's probably on their phones or consoles.
Right.
It's not the main reason they bought the headset.
So now you have these two very distinct audiences, these new groups of people using VR, and they're coming to it with totally different expectations and spending habits compared to those early adopters we talked about. That must be a lot for developers to think about.
Oh, for sure. And this actually ties into some of the concerns that Upload VR reported on. They talked to almost 24 VR studios who are worried about declining sales and how hard it is to get their games discovered on the platform. You can see how these developers who are targeting those hardcore VR fans in the beginning might be feeling the effects of these new audiences coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. So how has Meta responded to this?
Well, Pruitt actually directly addressed these concerns. He said pretty clearly that this shift in the audience, that's the biggest reason why some developers might be seeing less revenue. He didn't think it was because the Quest store opened up to more apps or that Meta's pushing Horizon World so much.
Which is Meta's own social VR platform, right?
Exactly. And Meta actually did some testing to see how much of an impact these things had. They looked at changes to how the store is laid out and how much they promoted Horizon Worlds. They found that the changes in spending related to those things were super small, like less than 1% for the store layout changes, and a maximum 3% decrease related to the Horizon Worlds promotion in their phone app. But get this, overall spending on the platform actually went up by 12% in 2024.
That's a good point. So even if some individual developers might be seeing changes in how much money they're making, the whole VR ecosystem on Quest is still growing financially.
Exactly. And I think Pruitt also made a good point about those hardcore VR enthusiasts. He said that they usually know what they want to buy already, so changes to the store don't really affect them much.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They're probably going to find those specific games no matter what, regardless of what's on the front page.
Right. So maybe the discoverability issue is more about reaching those newer VR users, the ones who might not know exactly what they're looking for yet.
That's a good point. And I think Pruitt's last comment in that article really sums up how complex all of this is.
What did he say?
He said, and I'm going to quote this whole thing because it's important, quote, "We realized that 2024 had a lot of change all at once. We spent a long time unpacking and untangling the impact of these changes because it's easy to conflate correlation with causation. The research isn't done yet. We're still learning and fine-tuning." For example, our store ranking algorithm has changed significantly several times over the last 12 months. It's an ongoing project, and we don't always get it right. Luckily, the data tells us pretty clearly when we've made mistakes so we can course correct.
Wow. That's really interesting. They're admitting that figuring this whole thing out is tough.
Yeah. They're being pretty transparent, which is, I think, a good thing. They're acknowledging that trying to keep up with all these changing user behaviors and the whole evolving VR landscape, it's not easy. And it sounds like they're actively looking at the data and making changes based on what they're seeing.
Yeah, I like that they're talking about constantly tweaking their store algorithm. It shows that they're aware of the problems developers are having getting their games seen.
Totally.
So let's zoom out for a second and look at the big picture here. It seems like the MetaQuest platform is definitely at this super interesting point. We're seeing tons of growth, both in the user base and how much people are using their headsets. But things are changing so fast, especially when it comes to who those users are and what they're doing in VR. The whole free-to-play explosion, this new generation of younger users who want those social and meme games.
Yeah.
And then you've got more and more adults who are using VR just to watch stuff on a virtual big screen. It feels like the whole VR landscape is shifting right before our eyes.
It absolutely is. And the big question that comes out of all of this is, there's this gap between how people are spending their time in VR, mostly on free stuff, and where most of the money is still being made, which is those paid titles.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about the future of VR, right?
Yeah.
Like, how can developers create content and make money in this new world?
Which is a perfect question for our listeners out there. Think about all these trends we talked about. The dominance of free-to-play, this younger crowd that loves social games and meme games,
Right.
and all these adults who are using VR as their personal cinema. What do you think all of this means for the future of VR content? And more importantly, how are developers going to adapt and make money? How are they going to reach all these different types of users with different needs and wants? Because it really does feel like we're at a crossroads in the VR world.
We are. And I hope that this whole conversation has given you some stuff to think about as you try to understand the VR landscape. Maybe you'll even check out some of those free-to-play games we talked about.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about that Gorilla Tag now.
It's a wild ride.
Or maybe even dive into the world of meme games. See what's grabbing the attention of these new VR users. Anyway, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. It's been fun.
Absolutely. Until next time.